I am so sorry about that.
Can you call the supervisor?
I cannot do that.
Can you just call the supervisor?
I cannot do that.
Call the fucking supervisor.
Okay, that's profanity. We're zero tolerance on profanity.
I'm sorry, it's just...
Yeah, I have to serve the next customer.
No.
Step away, ma'am.
God, just fucking help me! I'm so sorry.
I've called security.
Oh, no, please don't do that. I'm a 5-starring you. 5 stars?
What's the issue here, Hannah?
Intimidation and profanity.
Oh, no, I was not intimidating.
Don't speak, ma'am.
I was just trying to...
Okay, so, in order to restore calm, I'm invoking my authority as airport security to dock you 1 full ranking point as a punitive measure. This is a temporary measure.
No!
The score reverts to normal in 24 hours.
No, but I need it now.
Period, all down votes are subject to a ×2 multiplier.
×2?
We recommend you avoid negative feedback at this time.
I'm on double damage?
Please, remove yourself from the airport immediately.
That is probably my favorite episode of Black Mirror. It's called Nosedive. And I picked that episode because we're going to get into a little bit about what that episode covered. If you're not familiar with the show, Black Mirror, of course, takes place in the fictitious universe. In that episode in particular, the main character, Bryce Howard, there's a social credit score everybody has, or a social score people have. Imagine likes. And if you fall below a certain level, then it cuts off your access to things. And the main character is trying to move her way up the social ladder, and she finds out that she hires a professional credit score or social score raiser to basically tell her that you're really nice and you're doing a good job at being nice, but you need to be around a better caliber of person. And being around a better caliber of person will open up opportunities. You even get better jobs. You just get better access. So one of her childhood friends that was actually a bully invites her to a wedding that she's having. I think she wants to make her like a maid of honor. And the whole reason why this person, who's at a very high level above her, wants to do that because her advisor has told her, oh, well, if you want to get a higher status, then you need to be nicer to people that are in a class beneath you. So there's a lot of talk about China having a social credit score as well. So we're going to get into that and probably dispel a lot of myths about that. So first, let me bring on my co-host, my homie, my dog. His name is Pascal Robert.
Jason Miles, how are you doing, my brother, my comrade? How are you?
I'm okay. I'm ready to get this show on the road. Let's bring in our other co-host. It is Foreign Policy Thursday. So we have to bring in our foreign policy expert. You know him as Deep State Cuba.
Deep State Cuba.
And this is another friend of show. We actually wish she could be on more, but we're going to take advantage of her ability today. Let me wait. Hold on. I have the bio ready here because I want you guys to understand who we actually have on. Maria Repnikova. See the alerts you hear going off because people are so excited. Is an assistant professor in global communications at Georgia State University, a Wilson Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, and the author of the acclaimed book Media Politics in China: Improvising Power Under Authoritarianism. She was previously a post-doctoral fellow at the Project for Advanced Research in Global Communication at the Annenberg School for Communication, University of Pennsylvania, and a Rhodes Scholar at the University of Oxford. She speaks fluent Mandarin, Russian, and Spanish. She is the intelligent, the wonderful Maria Repnikova.
Привет, Maria. Привет.
Добрый вечер. Как дела?
That's about as far as my Russian goes, man.
Oh, that's it? Okay, that's it. All right.
Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be back.
So you're familiar with that Black Mirror episode.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites as well. I love that episode.
When it came out, everyone was like, "Oh, this is what's going on in China." And, you know, Charlie Booker, the guy that does the show, of course, bases a lot of the shows on real things.
Right. Yeah.
So right out of the gate, when you saw that, were you like, "Is this a parody of what people probably think is going on over there," or is that more of a? You think it's just more of a dystopian story of where we are today with social media?
Well, I guess we're not too far off in general because we are kind of being rated in terms of our credit scores, and we're not as far from China as we might think. But it is the case that in China, the more things are rated than they are in the US. Your political activities, even your moral or ethical behavior, somebody's score went down for mistreating their neighbor. So it's not just about politics, it's about kind of morality, and that's very subjective, and that gets rated. And if your score goes down, you can't take a train or you can't take a plane. So things are pretty serious, but it's not implemented nationally yet. It's still being tested, but it is in some ways similar. So it's not completely off.
Well, Maria, I read the article that you shared with us that was published in The Wire, the interview with you, which I found fascinating. Because frankly, I was assuming that the posture that you were going to take, based on this kind of perception that we have about China, was that they're all this totalitarian, harsh, abusive kind of nation in terms of how they use their telecommunications and their internet communications. But what I found particularly interesting is that you showed that there's a more kind of collective sense of communal participation in the way China's media creates the air of consent, and that there seems to be a kind of national zeitgeist around wanting to cooperate in building the Chinese project amongst its citizens. Can you elaborate on that for us and explain how perhaps our opinions in America about the kind of totalitarian nation of Chinese media curation might be somewhat surprising to the actual reality?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the assumption about Chinese media is definitely in that totalitarian kind of sphere where nothing is allowed, everything is surveilled, everybody's, potentially under threat of going to prison for whatever they say. So it's this kind of life in fear. And even just today, in my discussion with a fellow colleague, China, of course, comes up all the time. And somebody said, well, I'm so happy to be living in the US, but not in China. Kind of this idea that somehow if you're in China, like you're really just like under threat, right? So, but in reality, I mean, some people do, of course, face terrible policies, and they do have significant dangers, especially when they come from minority groups like Xinjiang, right? It's a completely different experience being a Uyghur versus being Han Chinese. But an average Han Chinese person doesn't face this sort of threats or pressures every day. And in fact, an average Han person probably supports the regime. They support the Chinese project, as you say, because it's been very successful for them. They're making money, they're consuming anything they want. They're traveling around the world, their salaries are going up, and they're very proud of Chinese nation becoming a global power. So in many ways, this kind of manufacturing of consent through many channels are discussed, like including the media, social media in particular, but also just Chinese economy doing better than that of other countries and China rising. It's really inspiring many people to actually support the party and even join the party, which is actually quite difficult. So it's not so much of a living in the constant shadow of a threat. It's also in some ways supporting and seeing China as in some ways more successful than the US. So that's becoming the reality for many young Chinese people.
And just to build a little on that, I think that when we think about politics from a Western perspective, we think of a conflictive relationship between different interest groups, electoral competition, a kind of competitive space. And in the United States especially, there's this meta-narrative of rebellion, pushing back against government, people versus government, this kind of dichotomy, this duality, with tyranny being the condition of having an overweening and overpowered authority, political authority. China, especially the People's Republic, developed out of a culture that had imperial roots, a kind of Confucian organic state with a seamless relationship between people and government. And while the authority of the central government, traditionally the emperor, now the party, is absolute, there's a sense that there is a reciprocal relationship. The term used is often harmony. There's a social harmony where the people can petition, the people can complain, as long as they don't challenge the foundations of the order. And Chinese people in the People's Republic, as opposed to Taiwan or Hong Kong, where there's exposure to Western models, a much longer exposure to Western models, don't have this assumption that politics must be or is intrinsically conflictual, and that your relationship with the government should be adversarial or rebellious. And instead, the idea that, we're advising, we're participating in this sort of junior role by alerting the authorities as to what's wrong, suggesting improvements, suggesting changes. That evolves out of pre-existing conceptions of the relationship between government and governed in China.
Right. I mean, this idea of harmony, or kind of the notion that there is certain ways of participating in governance without a full-scale, Western-style democracies, that's what's being sort of, propagated, but also it's been part of kind of this understanding historically, but especially under the communist rule, this notion of input institutions, that you can participate, petition, you can protest, you can critique, but you can't critique the very top. So you can't touch, the central level authority. And in my book about Chinese media, I found that the critique can be pretty serious, and the reporting is very professional, actually. So we often think again of Chinese media as this black box where nothing happens, but there are some really talented and professional journalists who do report on injustice of all kinds, but they don't touch on the very top of that system. So they will talk about provincial officials, they will talk about local officials, certain governance policies, but not specifically like Xi Jinping, or the whole structure of the Communist Party doesn't get challenged. But at the same time, those input institutions as channels are always in control of the party, so they can decide when to, narrow them, when to expand them, when to respond, when not to respond. So it is, the space is there, but it's not easily expandable. And this idea of kind of, Chinese-style democracy is also now being sold, or, at least suggested or offered to visitors from other developing countries. I was just writing a chapter in my book about China-Africa relations and soft power, and the idea of trainings. And I found that through the training materials that I analyzed, most of the time they present themselves as a democracy, right? So definitely not as an autocracy by any means. They hate the word authoritarian, so they use the word democracy with Chinese characteristics. And they talk about participatory channels, everything you just mentioned, Kuba, all those different mechanisms, and that they're working. So the only thing that's missing is national elections. Everything else is there. That's the sort of the way that they present their vision, but also the fact that it's working to achieve economic ends, right? 700 million people lifted out of poverty is what they sell as the key matrix of success. They're responding to public demands. And then they have, African journalists interview, farmers that were kind of specifically picked up for an interview, who will say, my life has significantly improved. So I see human rights as economic development. Like for him, human rights is economic growth. So that's how they kind of position and tell that story, which can be quite powerful, But of course, also, everybody takes it with a critical kind of grain of salt, but that's the story China is telling to the world, not only to itself.
And I think that one thing that Westerners, and especially Americans, miss about the late Cold War popularity of the Western model and the sort of universal embrace of Western-style political systems is how closely the appeal of democracy mirrored the success of the Western economic model. That you had African countries, Asian countries, Eastern European countries pushing for political reform along Western lines, not so much because they bought into the underlying philosophy, not to secure necessarily civic rights, but because they were convinced that this was an essential element of a developmental story, which would allow them to attain the same development, well-being, technological sophistication as the West. And after the eclipse of the Soviet Union, it seemed like that was the only show in town. That was the only model that could get you there. And now China is demonstrating that there is an alternative. You don't need to go into full competitive elections. You don't need to develop a sort of civic, rights-based, individualistic society, there is this alternative and it works. And that part of it, the fact that it works, that it can deliver, is an essential element of soft power. And that's what's allowing China to become competitive, even as the United States, flails and has its own challenges and a kind of massive airing of dirty laundry that's occurred over the last 10 years since the financial crisis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's true, but there's also kind of the notion of to what extent any of this can be exported or taught, right, to anyone else. And at least I'm finding that's, it's inspiring, and definitely, I don't think it's only for individuals from developing countries. Studies show that even students, high schoolers from the US, there's an interesting book that just came out on Confucius Institutes. They come from the US and they've never been to China, and the first sense is that they're very inspired. They see this, as a very shocking kind of, show of modernity, like how developed China is. But then very quickly, there's also other sentiments come into play, whether or not this is at a cost of, other types of freedoms when it comes to Americans, but when it comes to African visitors, they often think about, is this something we can really somehow implement, back home? Is this something that's feasible to study? And China or Chinese officials are not teaching that. They're mostly just showing off the success. So it is powerful, but it's also kind of has certain limitations when it comes to, tangible skills or knowledge, because their approach is not to teach a model, and that could also be a strength. But whereas the US, of course, has been exporting a certain model and very much kind of exporting a certain way of, as you say, kind of combining economic development with democracy, and all of that as itself in an industry. So that kind of came about for many, many decades. China is saying, we don't want to export anything. We're just going to show you around, and you have a great trip, and then you go home and do what you want. So that's kind of their approach to soft power. And in some ways it works, in some ways it's also lacking certain things.
And building those institutions is not easy. It's not a model that you can replicate. There's no turnkey solution. You can't import 1,000 Chinese technocrats and have them stand up your own neo-Confucian state-directed consent and consultation mechanism. That's not going to happen. You need a tremendous amount of IT infrastructure. You need a highly online population, and you need cadres at the appropriate price point and at the appropriate level of education and sophistication to be able to actually execute this for you.
Right. You need the manpower.
First thing I want to say is that super chats are open to all viewers, just to let you know that. Second thing I wanted to say also is that I was fascinated by the degree in which your interview demonstrated how much the CCP cares about being very careful about assessing the opinion of the population about the government and about the regime, and how I was very surprised the extent to which public opinion and protest against certain government initiatives is welcomed in China and is curated as a kind of collective participation. Can you elaborate a little bit more? I know you spoke a bit about that, about how that actually functions in practical terms with the Chinese media infrastructure.
Sure. I mean, one of the big ways is actually doing public opinion studies systematically. There's institutions now in charge of that, and even the main Chinese newspaper, People's Daily, has a specific branch that does public opinion study. So that means they're collecting large, scale data about public discussions on social media. So China has an equivalent of Twitter. It's called Weibo, and it's very popular. It's been somewhat, shrinking under President Xi because of restrictions on Weibo. So some accounts got deleted because they were too popular and allegedly spreading rumors, So there was some kind of criminalization of rumors. So some of that kind of has shrunk, but the discussions still go on, and they're very vibrant. So they can go on various topics from, U.S. economy and takeover of the Congress to all kinds of other, domestic issues. So they're watching for what's becoming a hot issue, how it's being discussed. Another way to do it is to actually kind of channel or sort of start a discussion themselves. That would start, asking people, what do you think about a certain issue or a topic, and what could be improved? So it's kind of like more top-down solicitation of feedback. And then local officials are required to have social media profiles. They have an account on Twitter, basically on Chinese version of Twitter, and they need to be active and responding. And there are all kinds of mechanisms also along those lines to collect feedback. And of course, there are also physical protests, and they're very, very prevalent, and many people participate, but on very specific issues. One of the big issues is environmental degradation. So dirty rivers, dirty water, polluting factories, air pollution, all of that has been attracting a lot of attention. The physical manifestation, the physical protest is, as much as it's sort of welcomed, it's the most dangerous, form. So they try to avoid that by first responding to online, critiques, and then hopefully mitigating that so people don't come out. If they do come out, that's a much higher risk.
And
Yeah.
And it's a fundamental problem. One fundamental problem of any authoritarian system or any regime which practices large-scale censorship, or where the elite is significantly out of touch with the rest of the population, and I think that the United States is getting to this point, is that you lose the ability to track public opinion. You lose the ability to know what people are actually saying. They're compelled by, by some kind of sanction, be it, a formalized social credit system, or, I hate to say cancel culture, but there's not just the kind of leftist variant of it, but also, especially on a regional level in the United States, you have very conservative cultures where city level, town level, where you can lose your job if you are too far to the left. So that kind of sanction prevents people from expressing their opinions publicly. Then the government doesn't know what they're actually thinking. In the Soviet Union, there was an awareness that large-scale indoctrination and control of the media were preventing an accurate reading of public opinion. And one of the duties of the KGB was actually to monitor internal public opinion so that the Soviet government knew what people were really thinking, because it was impossible to get an honest answer if you just did polling or other types of research. And when you have a separation of a media class, like in the United States, which is very distinct from the regional and local cultures that it's supposed to be representing, it's supposed to be communicating with and for, then you actually have something similar where what you read in newspapers and what gets to decision makers, what gets to policymaking elites, does not reflect the actual opinions of large numbers of real people. It's a minority position that's been ideologically shaped. This technique, the techniques that Maria outlined in her interview, things like the digital consultation, things like surveilling WeChat discussions, following what people are saying online, and also allowing space for protest, is a way for a communist party that understands that there is an official ideological line that it's enforcing to get that feedback on conditions that real people care about in order to try to cut off large-scale protest or dissatisfaction at the pass, so to speak.
Right. Yeah. It's some people called it. Some scholars call it responsive authoritarianism, consultative authoritarianism. There's kind of terms that were used to soften the term authoritarianism by suggesting there's some of these consultations that are taking place.
Well, if you listen to Kuba's Polish brother Zbigniew Brzezinski, the United States has been doing that for the last 20 years as well. So, I mean, who exactly is who to call someone authoritarian?
I was gonna say, I mean, that literally happened to me, and I actually got to do an interview on NPR, if you want to check it out, about getting
I want to
getting
check it
banned.
out.
You should. It was me and Shoshana Zuboff, the author of Surveillance Capital. Honestly, they got the wrong show, and the producer just liked the interview he had with me, so he was like, we'll keep it. But the whole show was about how private corporations are doing literally the same function, and it doesn't seem to be used. It feels like the way you guys are describing this is the government's trying to get a handle on the which way the tide is going, where here it seems to be kind of the total opposite. Like, we don't really care which way the tide is going. We just want to shut people up that are saying things that we may not want to hear, and definitely want people to buy certain things.
Well, I think that part of it is the American elites have drunk their own Kool-Aid. They believe that they are legitimate because of Constitution, because of election, because America is the greatest country in the world, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So any significant deviation, any significant criticism of the status quo is by nature illegitimate. And there's also a entrenched class snobbery here that if you fail to couch your criticism in the appropriate policy wonk, DNC, RNC, media class, talking points and language and jargon, if you disrespect the Overton window, if you're a little too angry about the wrong things, then it's sort of like, why are you even speaking? Why do we have to entertain this peasant? And that's on the political side, but there's still a tremendous use for insights into public opinion, and that all gets captured by private companies. And one of my favorite crazy Christian conservatives, Rod Dreher, is convinced that Chinese-style social credit is going to be introduced by private corporations as a means of identifying and preemptively repressing Christian conservatives who might dissent on things like gay rights or transgendered rights. And the way that Twitter, if you think about the Chinese surveillance and enforcement of conformity on Chinese social media, that's done by a government agency, and so it's considered censorship, repression. While in the United States, you have Twitter and Facebook that serve a similar monitoring and enforcement function, but that's because it's private, it's somehow considered no longer to be a civil rights issue. People complain about it, but it's more like working the ref than actually having an issue with the system. And there is this disturbing convergence between privatized American social media management and the Chinese version.
It's interesting because I just got a book. I started reading it. Surveillance Valley, Yasha Levine, The Secret Military History of the Internet. And basically the premise of the book is that the whole function of the internet was created as a military surveillance tool. And that the current manifestation of surveillance capitalism, some would say, that we have with its utility is not a remote deviation from the original manifestation of what caused it to be born as a technological development. So I find it kind of fascinating that always people talk about free internet and how the internet increases freedom and freedom of speech, when in reality it just proliferates digital surveillance.
I mean, as the official representative from the deep state, I can assure you that it's not lost on the American security apparatus that this is a fantastic surveillance mechanism and that it has tremendous utility in identifying domestic sources of dissent and domestic threats to the status quo, as well as enemies abroad. And what's interesting for me in terms of the comparison between the United States and China is that in China there is a very clear subordination of corporate power and the haute bourgeoisie to political power. Every once in a while they shoot a billionaire. Like just ask Jack Ma if he's above the law, and it'll be very clear who calls the shots in China. While in the United States, the DARPA and the Pentagon and other sort of deep state technology programs helped seed the technology, helped make the initial investments, helped develop the infrastructure that led to the commercial internet. But right now, the commercial giants, Amazon, Google, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, have actually outgrown the ability of the military-industrial complex to corral them. They can be asked nicely, and when there's a convergence of interests, like with the Patriot Act, then they'll go along with government requests for surveillance. When they think that they can get away with it, they'll push back. When they think that there's something in it for them, like Amazon Web Services winning contracts to host significant portions of the government IT infrastructure, or Microsoft doing the same, they'll bend their professed rules and their professed open internet principles in order to secure those contracts and gain that influence. But it's much more of a bargain and a much more balanced relationship than the type of subordination that you see in Chinese IT firms.
Well, don't you think there's more cross-pollination? I mean, we have Amazon in America that basically does cloud contracting with the CIA and intelligence. So with that being said, who's to say that we don't have more of an integrated relationship between intelligence industries, domestic intelligence industries, and these private corporations than we realize? I mean, we have Zuckerberg fully cooperating with the exiges of American government and intelligence in terms of monitoring Facebook comments and so on and so forth. So I don't underestimate the coercive or incentivized capacity of the intelligence community to get these private corporations to participate with their desires in terms of monitoring their users.
There is a difference between coercion and incentives, though.
Well, can I ask you a question?
That's the essence of it.
Kuba and Maria, I have a question for both of you, actually, to what Pascal was saying. There is a very mediocre documentary about surveillance and social media that I honestly really didn't like. And it doesn't. It's a pretty newer one on Netflix where it's kind of one of those things where the people that created the mechanisms that we're complaining about today are kind of trying to shake their fists at Facebook for being meanies. But they're not really putting it in. They kind of try to blame Facebook for Myanmar, but they didn't give Facebook any credit for Modi. Which I've seen the video. You can see it. Mark Zuckerberg kind of congratulating Modi on his victory some years ago. How do you guys view U.S. social media from that standpoint? Helping getting people elected. Duterte as well, not just Facebook. We have to keep in mind they also own
WhatsApp is big, man.
I'm sorry, WhatsApp. Thank you.
So I think that there's a blind spot for big social media companies about what's going on abroad, especially in smaller markets. They have a platform that's designed basically for Western audiences, and they really care about penetration into places like India and China, where they see a lot of growth potential. But they turn on their system in the Philippines, and then it gets used by local actors. And we shouldn't discount the agency of people like Duterte or the Myanmar anti-Rohingya movement. These are actual groups. They're not AstroTurf. They weren't created in Langley. And they see a tool that allows them to get a much stronger communications and command and control infrastructure than they would otherwise have, that would otherwise be available to them. And if you've got a disciplined organization already, then you can use that to fight your domestic battles. So I don't think that it's you can fault the platform necessarily. The platform just exaggerates certain advantages that typically reactionary groups enjoy in these specific countries.
Maria, did you have an opinion on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's just, first of all, I think when we're comparing US and China with this social media, environments, I think it's tempting to kind of put them all into this one sort of dark box that everything, I mean, obviously there are terrible problems on both sides, and there's collusion between companies and the government on both sides, and it's not a very democratic space on both sides. So there's always kind of issues that are very easy to sort of merge them together, but I'm always a bit wary of sort of making them sound a little too similar. As someone who studies China for a long time and, goes there regularly, the social media environment and the media environment is still significantly more as Cuba, kind of much more coercive. So, other than being deleted on Chinese Twitter, you can be literally detained and go to jail for posting something critical of the government and spreading rumors, which could be anything. I mean, rumors is very subjective. So that's something that's now spreading, Russia as well, as anti-extremism legislation and, naming certain organizations foreign agents and so forth. So there's just a lot more severe consequences for speaking out on many issues, even though they might not be immediately kind of targeting the top of the party. They might still come out as too critical. So I think that's one of the issues. And the other issue that may be a little bit more similar to the US is just the rise of nationalism online, where we just see such aggressive kind of mob, right, kind of sentiments expressed against anybody who's critical in China. So there was a writer from Wuhan, Fang Fang, who wrote about the pandemic and was quite critical of government response. She was attacked not just by Chinese government, but by the mob of nationalists online. That's really terrible, commentaries about her, and some of the professors who work with her were attacked as well. So I think there's this kind of attack of the mob that I guess kind of, speaks to both sides. But when it comes to government itself, it is a lot more coercive. So I think we just have to be kind of careful about maybe not making them sound, almost like on par with one another. I mean, the problems are, equally challenging, but in China, it's much harder to be outspoken about politics, basically, on social media. So I just wanted to point out.
Picking up on that, and something else that you mentioned in the interview, China has this China dream. Xi Jinping announced a China dream, a kind of new mission, a new identity, a new national purpose for China. Both, this is the future for Chinese people, and this is China's role in the world, mission in the world. Do you think that the way that they use social media to get that message across is effective? And I'm also curious about the sort of wolf warrior phenomenon. Some operators within the Chinese Communist Party who may not speak for the center are able to get on social media and sort of push things further right or in a more nationalist direction by mobilizing this mob that you're talking about.
I'm just looking at the chat and I saw that somebody said China Dream sounds like a brand of heroin.
The good stuff.
That was me. That was me.
Oh, I see. That's a good, I don't know. It does sound like a pretty interesting product. Anyway, yeah, the China Dream as a slogan has kind of actually faded. It didn't get, it got to a certain point and it faded out. So it's not as prominent anymore. The Belt and Road Initiative is a little bit more up there at this point. So China Dream is kind of softened out and not as popular. But the wolf warrior diplomacy and Chinese officials being very visible and very aggressive on social media, on Twitter especially, is increasing as a phenomenon. There are more and more of them, and including in developing countries. So it's not just like the US or Australia, they're kind of spreading. And it's unclear to what extent it's like a top-down policy or if there's actually critique of that. So when I was in China last, I saw, both opinions expressed quite openly. Some said China needs to be more aggressive because, we've been too soft, and it's all this idea of kind of telling the China story, the pandas, very sweet pandas everywhere, China doing great, Xi Jinping is visiting a factory, nobody cares, right? Like, that's not really exciting. But also like China being attacked by the West all the time and being kind of this softy and not really reacting. So some of them got really inspired by Russia as well. So Russia is much more tough, right? Like, it just responds and attacks back. So some of these officials really see themselves as like being really patriotic. That's kind of one side. The other side of it is that mostly it's for domestic audience. A lot of these comments get translated to Chinese very quickly and are spread on Chinese social media. The Chinese nationalists love it. Chinese youth loves it. So this message is really effective for domestic publics. So oftentimes, you hear Chinese, American, European officials say, Chinese are failing at soft power. They're failing at diplomacy. They put the most awkward messages online. They're so aggressive, and all these things. But at the same time, a lot of these messages are not meant for them. They're actually meant for Chinese people. So in that case, is it failing or succeeding? That depends on how you see success here. So it's a really interesting development, but I think it's not going to go away anytime soon. So we'll see more and more awkward phrases.
Another thing that you brought up is the toad worshiper phenomenon. And personally, I think that Jiang Zemin is the most underrated statesman of the 20th century.
He's very cute.
Think about it. He managed, what impresses me about him most is that he managed the rise of China without triggering Western response. Like, it was still a moment where China was economically vulnerable and could have been choked off by lack of investment, controls on technology transfer, that kind of thing. But he would just play the piano and make some goofy jokes and wear those corny glasses and not trigger anyone. Do you think that there's been a shift in the tone of the central leadership, especially towards this more Russian, this more confrontational rhetoric? And do you think Jiang Zemin was that it's a change in the times, or Jiang Zemin was holding back his nationalists effectively at that point, and now there's sort of there's much freer reign on the expression of a nationalist confrontational rhetoric?
Yeah, I think it's both. I mean, two different forces, leadership forces and public itself becoming more nationalist, and China itself changing. So there's all these different forces coming together. But Jiang Zemin, for those of you who haven't, followed toad worship culture, is a very popular character, like on social media, and there are many young people who worship, Jiang Zemin, and they post pictures of him in different settings, and they're kind of memes or popular culture where he would kind of get, copied and pasted into different settings and make cute jokes. And he had very funny responses to journalists, and he had those great spectacles, and just he had the charisma and the kind of warmth, right? And the kind of
I aspire to the charisma of Jiang Zemin.
Right, it's an amazing charisma that actually very few leaders had, right? Like, Hu Jintao wasn't particularly charismatic, either. Even though I always joke with my friend that I thought he was like the coolest guy, but nobody, really. Xi Jinping obviously has a very different style, but it's definitely not that kind of charismatic playfulness. It's something totally different. So I think there is that kind of nostalgia for that sort of, playfulness and liveliness, and kind of something that you can sort of find your leader, charismatic and inspiring and funny. I think that's something that a lot of young people who actually didn't really grow up under Jiang Zemin, they really miss through photos, through, the storytelling. But I think, China has changed on all these different dimensions, and part of it is that it sees itself now as really kind of having risen, like it's a global power. It wants recognition, respect, and being kind of playing piano or being cute or being whatever, that's not enough, right? You got to kind of show up and be show strength. And I think part of that maybe is inspired a bit by Russia, but part of it is coming from internally as well. So I think that's the path that it's on at the moment. And even if a new leader comes in, Chinese public is very nationalistic, so it's hard to imagine them wanting like a softer, sort of milder tone in international affairs.
Maria, I wanted to ask you, how much is the zeitgeist in China amongst its citizenry motivated by an actual desire to compete or best the United States? Is that something, I know, there are rumors that during the Cold War with the Soviet Union, that was a kind of part of the ideological infrastructure. Does that sense of consciousness penetrate deeply into the Chinese media infrastructure or the consciousness of the Chinese people? Or is that really something that is kind of manufactured by the American elites who try to see China as some kind of, the new great competitor?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think the anti-Americanism in Chinese media is actually a fairly new phenomenon. Like I've noticed it in the past few years. And it was interesting to watch under Trump that at some point, actually, he was treated very cautiously when I was visiting China. So I heard from editors that, we can't criticize, we can't write anything critical. US is still very much an ally, like, we're competitors, but, very carefully managing this relationship. But then at some point there was this twist and it was like, we can criticize anything about Trump, and like they were allowed to write anything critical. So suddenly stories just popping out about every possible, fault line, every possible policy, and then more and more so using kind of basically everything that we have wrong here in the US to trigger more nationalism. So like the BLM protests were, reported widely and in so much detail, showcasing like the fractures and everything that's not working here. The racial injustice, and the Chinese people were talking about it very actively, like look at the US pointing finger at us. Whenever they hear critique about Xinjiang, they talk about that. So there is that kind of anti-Americanism rising, but I think that also it's important to know that unlike the Soviet time or the Cold War, Chinese have also been really conditioned by American culture. They've traveled here, the youth, they've traveled here to study. They still want to come here to study. Many journalists have been trained here and interning here. Chinese companies have worked here. So it's a really integrated relationship. So in that sense, it's kind of a contradictory, sentiment. They love and hate the US. But I think if you ask young people, they would still find themselves very curious and engaged and wanting to come here and spend time here. That's my impression.
One interesting development that happened over the last 5-6 years, maybe since Trump, but I think a little bit before that, was that the United States replaced Japan as the main foreign bogeyman Japan used to be the number one enemy of China, the great historical antagonist, and that was the target when you wanted to rile up nationalist sentiment. And now you hear a lot less about Japan, and more of the fire is concentrated on the United States. I wonder if how much that has to do with practical changes or practical developments, and how much is just leveling up. You know, you've beaten Japan already, and now you're going after the final boss.
Yeah, Japan is definitely in the dust, right? We don't hear as much about Japan. When I started learning Chinese, which was in like 2000, I think it was in 2001, Japanese classes were full. Everybody was learning Japanese, and Chinese was like, you know, almost empty. Like there were very few students. It was kind of like an adventure with, you know, teachers giving you all the attention at that moment. But Japanese was really, really hot. But now, of course, like if you ask, you know, there are very few students of Japanese, and Japan is not seen as kind of an adversary. It's actually seen as an ally in Asia Pacific. So I think it's very much, the relationship is very much evolved. But China is kind of the main, I think, the main target, the main kind of shadow, the mirror, you know, if you will. So, you know, Biden's speech, I didn't actually watch it last night, but I heard and read through it briefly that China came up several times, Xi Jinping came up, and US having to win the 21st century, right? Like, what does that mean? You know, this kind of alliance of democracies against basically autocracies, but I think implicitly China is clearly like the language that's being used in foreign policy, which is, you know, troubling and interesting, but that's very much pointing at China as the key player.
I actually don't. I kind of push back against the notion that Chinese circumspection about America's interest is anti-Americanism. I think it's actually a legitimate way to deal with a superpower, an imperialist superpower that is targeting you as an enemy, and that to be circumspect about the United States is a natural reaction. So I don't want to frame the question in the way of saying Chinese quote unquote anti-Americanism, but I'm more looking at as the Chinese people being vested in competing with America on pure terms of productivity, economic competition, educational, intellectual, and otherwise, and besting them for, you know, historical, cultural, and other reasons as well. Less so much so out of this kind of, although Americans are evil, or the normal kind of tropes that we use to make it seem like, oh, they hate us, or they hate us because of
they
our
hate
freedom.
us for our freedom. Yeah,
they hate us for our freedom and all that other ridiculous stuff. I think that the ideology of yellow peril that is rooted in America's paranoia about Asians overall, and the way in which the Asian countries have always fixated a particular kind of adversarial connotation in the minds of Western nations and Western countries is not something that is lost on the Chinese at all whatsoever. And I think that they have a much longer and more cognizant awareness of their history relative to Western and European powers and nations. On that point, one of the things that I found interesting about that interview, the article that you sent, and hopefully we can get a way to share that, is that you discussed how the external media, when I mean external media institutions that China has in foreign countries, the same way the Russians have RT, and I know the Chinese have a YouTube presence as well. You made it was a very interesting question that you answered in distinguishing the difference between how RT and Russian media covers American phenomenon in the United States, and the Chinese cover American phenomenon in the United States. And you said, at least up until now, the Russian propaganda mechanism, or news mechanism, I shouldn't say propaganda, is to always point at the faults and social fractures that exist in the US. But ironically, according to the interview you shared, the Chinese don't use that methodology, or at least they have not up until now. Can you elaborate a bit more on that?
Yeah, up until now, and I think still to a large extent now, there's kind of a comparison that I make between Russian, external communication, you can call it propaganda, you can call it media communication, and China is that I call it contrasted with constructive versus destructive. So Russia TV, Russia RT tends to destruct the West. Like it's the whole purpose is to kind of present a very negative perspective about the US in particular, but also the West at large. Whereas Chinese media tends to be focused on constructing its own story. So they have this mode of journalism called constructive journalism, where it's all about positive and kind of hopeful narratives about China. So it's more about China versus, the other parts of the world. So that's the difference. And these constructive stories can be very soft and sometimes maybe a little bit boring. So lately there's a bit more adversarial tone to this coverage, but for a while it's been all about constructive reporting. So constructive versus destructive, that's the big difference.
And one other thing that I'd focus on is, first of all, Pascal, I didn't mean to imply that there was no basis for Chinese hostility or suspicion or competition with the United States. China has its interests, and they're conflicted with the United States. The United States is setting up China as its rival, so it's not illegitimate for there to be that kind of hostility to especially the American state. But sometimes it goes further into prejudice, and there is a real risk of nationalist hatred anywhere. That can happen anywhere. During an Asia Cup game, there was a bad call that disfavored the Chinese team when they were playing the Japanese team. The Japanese team won the game as a result, and they had to shut down an entire area of the city around the stadium because the Japanese team was at risk of being hurt by the nationalist fans. But the Chinese overseas media also is less sophisticated. It also understands Western audiences less well than the Russian media. Summer and I were watching the Chinese channel here in Canada, and it was a documentary about a region of China which had this storied tradition, and the caption was supposed to say "home of literature," and this is a TV program. They have editors. They have people to vet this. This is being broadcast internationally. It's at home of literature with a T. And Russia Today doesn't make those mistakes.
Do you have any thoughts on that, Maria?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways they're a little more awkward. So there is that kind of occasional mistakes, or maybe they're a little bit less understanding of the audience. But I think that's changing very fast because they're localizing their production rapidly. So if you go to the office of CGTN is the main television network, Chinese global television station in London, for instance, you'll see a lot of former BBC, Al Jazeera reporters working for them, and also in Beijing. And in Africa, like in Nairobi, you have, I don't know what the percentage is, but at least half, I think, African staff poached from very, famous African publications, in Kenya, but also all over the continent. So in many ways, they're offering more stable salaries. They're not necessarily higher salaries, but they're more stable employment opportunities than, say, like Western media, where, as you know, it's really hard to get a job in CNN or somewhere else. So they're cutting staff when Chinese are hiring. So I think that kind of like awkwardness and the sort of, not understanding the audience, that might shift quickly because they have different people producing it now. The problem is largely that there is still a lot of censorship. So there's still, you can't tell the China stories that are very exciting because they're sensitive. And from what I heard, they're more and more sensitive. So people want to see the more exciting stories. What's China really about? If that's all about China's story, then what is the story? But they're not telling those stories as much or as vividly because they're not really allowed to. So that becomes, I think, a bigger issue. But as far as like the content production, I think that's becoming more sophisticated in time. They're willing to pay. They have a lot of money to invest in their media. So that's something to kind of keep in mind.
I want to say thanks, Steve, for the super chat out there. We got a Wi-Fi booster. Wi-Fi is working much better than it has in the past. Relax. But thanks for the super chat. Larger point is that we're coming up on an hour. I had a few more questions, but I think we got to get Jason on here because we may be moving into our patron only.
We got like 6 minutes left, and I just want to close out with saying thank you guys so much for tuning in today. Today has been a crazy day on the production side of This Is Revolution. Since we started the show, I don't think I've ever said this on air, even when it was just me in a room in the studio talking to no one. To be able to advertise on Facebook, which at one time was where the majority of the views were coming from, you have to have a website and an email, and the email has to match website. So you just can't have a Gmail account. So I had to pay to get a website, but we never got the website put up. the gentleman that's actually helped me with all the images that you see for the show, the merchandise that's coming for the show very shortly. Hopefully this weekend it'll be up. So we've never had a website, and every week I get a message of the image that's up on the website because it is not Pascal or myself. Pascal has even sent me an email saying, who the fuck is this guy and what is this? So the website is finally about to be up. I actually, as I'm talking to you right now, I just got a message from the person that's actually putting it together. And on the website, you'll be able to find, of course, past shows. It'll link you to past shows. It'll also link you to some merchandise that we were making. Pascal saw some of the images. I think Kuba saw some images too. Did you see him, Kuba? I'm pretty fucking stoked for it. So that's coming hopefully this weekend. Also, we're doing our Saturday free show where we just go and go and go until eventually I get yelled at to stop. And we're going to have Mr. Fish, who is a political cartoonist and journalist. He does a lot of the cartoons for Truth Dig at the moment. He definitely did stuff for The Nation and LA Times, another pretty big publication, but he was kind of too radical for them. So we're going to talk about his latest book, Nobody Left, where he actually interviewed a lot of figures from kind of what you would call the new left of the 60s and kind of asked them what happened. So that's going to be a fun show, and the whole gang will be there minus Paul. Paul won't be able to be there. He's doing a speech for May Day in his native Philadelphia. I will also ask, I know we got an hour from Maria. I don't know if you have any more time that we can steal from you. If we could steal you for longer, we'd appreciate it, because I just got the message that Jean Bajlan will be joining us for the after hours segment. So we're going to have full house in the after hours. And we can go deeper into the China discussion. And I do want to ask the chat, are you guys enjoying this talk so far? I see there's been a lot of chatter in the chat. Is everybody enjoying the conversation? And everybody gets quiet now when I ask that question. But if you're not a patron, you can be one and get the link to the show, and you can watch the after hours segment where it gets a lot more fun.
Book recommendations. Got some book recommendations.
What do you recommend?
Surveillance Valley, Yasha Levine, The Secret Military History of the Internet. Just got. Oh, that's. Is
that your book, Maria?
No, it's something I just really love. I think you guys would like it too. It's called Soft Power Internationalism.
I would like that.
Also, read The Three Body Problem. It's if you're looking for some fiction, it's a sci-fi story, but it has a lot of insight if you look at the perspective from which it's being written, like very long time horizons, real live Asian characters, but cookie cutter American caricatures. Definitely. Watch it before the movie read it before the movie comes out.
And also, I forgot. I don't know why I forgot. Now I remember, while we have a little bit of time. We're doing a special Friday show. A lot of times beforehand, when we had a guest that couldn't meet our Tuesday, Saturday, Thursday shows, we would just do an audio interview. But I really wanted to be interactive with this show because I'm a fan of of our guest's work. We will be talking with Vijay Prashad tomorrow. Are you ready for that one, Pascal?
Oh, I will be ready. Are we going to live stream? Are we going to live stream that, or is that going to be?
We're going to live stream it. Yeah. We're going to do it at 6. So tomorrow at 6 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, we'll be talking with Vijay Prashad. He has a book that I think came out a year ago, Washington Bullets, and we're definitely going to be talking about his work on kind of a people's history, if you will, of third world nations, the darker nations. We'll be talking about all that good stuff. Socialism in the third world, developing nations. On All right. Do you guys have any comments? Anything you want to say to the crowd before we leave?
Maria hasn't confirmed she's coming to the after hours, man.
I will be there for 30 minutes.
That's all we got is 30 minutes?
30 minutes. I have to go fix my bike after. I have some mission to accomplish.
You got
Come on, you have
like
you have to
Harley?
overfulfill quota. What kind of height are you?
I'm all overextended, you know. All my molecules are popping out, you know.
Well, I appreciate it. I appreciate you. Of course, Cuba is one part of the foreign policy crew. You know, the other part of the foreign policy crew is Jean Bajlan, and he will be joining us very shortly. So if you are a patron, I already put the link up. Give us about 10 minutes or so, and we will be there. And thank you very much for the super chat. Expect some changes around mid-May, like positive changes about the setup.